Greetings and salutations. Welcome to the Easy Linux Show, version 18.1, recorded on January the 3rd, 2018. I'm Joe Collins, and today what I'm going to do is show you how to configure Linux Mint once you get it installed. We're going to go through all of the steps you see on the screen. These will also be in the description for this particular video. So get your notepads out if you want to take notes. You can make some notes along with the information that I'm going to provide, and the next time that you install Linux Mint, you'll be ready to rock and roll. So let's first of all talk a little bit about what these configurations are. When you first install Linux Mint and you reboot it for the very first time, it is mostly ready to go, but there are some things that you will need to do, mainly configuring the system and making sure that all of the updates and drivers get installed. You also might want to set static IP addresses if you happen to be using some sort of service on your network like SSH or something else that would require that. Also, we're going to look at a couple of little tweaks that you can do to improve the performance of the system. So let's go ahead and jump right into this. By the way, this does not matter what Linux Mint version you install, what desktop that you chose. We will be using Cinnamon in our example today, but everything that I'm going to show you applies to pretty much all versions of Linux Mint 18.3, except for maybe KDE. You might find that a couple of the applications aren't there. So I'm going to go ahead and restart Linux Mint so we can get to the first boot screen, and we're just going to jump in and start doing it, and we'll talk about it as we roll along. And this is something that I do with all of the clients that I work with directly or have worked with in the past. I don't do a lot of that anymore, but I still support a few people, and this is what I do when I do an install on one of my own machines, and it has proven to be something that makes a big difference in the experience that you get once you get the system set up and running. If you do these steps, you do them in the right order, then you should have a trouble-free experience using Linux Mint. So go ahead and log in. When you get to the screen, login screen there, and we'll get to a desktop and we can begin. It is telling us that we're running in software rendering mode because we are not running the proper drivers as of yet. If you see that, that will probably mean that you'll have to install drivers or that your video card is not capable of handling Linux Mint with the Cinnamon desktop. You may not see that in other desktops. We can go ahead and close the welcome screen. We're not going to need that. And I am going to do one thing that's not on the list. It's desktop specific. I'm going to make these fonts a bit bigger, and that way we will be able to see what we're doing. And if I type that in correctly, it would certainly help. And I'm just going to scale them up a little bit here to make them nice and big. If you're setting this up for yourself, then I would suggest that you go through and set them up one by one instead of doing what I did, which was just scaling the entire desktop. But that'll work for what we're doing today. So you've booted up Linux Mint 18.3 for the first time. Your very first step that you want to do is to set up the Update Manager. And you'll find it down here in the lower right-hand corner. It's the little shield. And what I tell people to do is go ahead and set it to update everything. They have some other options here where it will hold back certain packages, things like the kernel and some of the more sensitive packages. And that is not the most secure way to go. So I just go ahead and tell people to update everything. And I have been doing this since this feature was added to Linux Mint with no major issues. So that is updated. Let's go check our list. I want to see what I have next. We're going to switch to a local mirror, and it will prompt you to switch to a local mirror. It's right there. So click OK. This is before we install anything. This will make things go a lot faster if you go ahead and do this. So here are the local mirrors. This is the list, and it should figure out what country you're in because during install you gave it a location, so it will pick mirrors that are available to you. Now, I always pick James Madison University because that is the local mirror that is the closest to me. So we pick it for Linux Mint, and then we're also going to pick it for Ubuntu. And I'm just going to look down the list. It's here somewhere. There it is, JMU. And now the mirrors are chosen. Just go ahead and close this for now. And then the very next thing to do is to click refresh. And that will go out and get the latest updates on whatever mirror you have chosen. And that's really important to do that, because if you don't refresh before you install, it will most likely give you some sort of big error message. So you want to make sure that you do that. While it's doing that, just let me cheat here and look at my list. Okay, know where we're at. We're good. And this will take a couple of seconds to refresh the updates for the first time. After this, it should go very, very quickly. And I'm not going to make you sit through the entire installation process for the updates. It does take time, so I will pause the video, and you will be able to just see things when interesting stuff comes up on the screen. You won't have to sit through watching it work. And it's getting itself together, and now it says this is the update that's available. So we'll go ahead and install this update, which is actually the upgrade info. And you may see an update there for like Mint Update, which is the program that we're using. So there it goes. And now we have a whole list of updates that need to be installed. So when you install these updates, make sure that you don't do anything with the machine. This is not the time to go playing around with the desktop or installing anything. Or it won't let you install anything, but changing configurations, things like that, because it is updating, which means that certain parts of the system that you see, certain parts of the desktop, they may become unstable. You don't want to mess with that until all of the updates are installed. So we'll go ahead and get that started, and it will go out and download. And it's telling us that it's going to install a couple of extra things. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. Once again, it asks for your password. Anytime that you install software on Linux Mint or Ubuntu, it will ask you for a password. And now it is going to go off and download and install all this stuff. And we will pause the video and come back when it is finished. The updates are just about complete. If you receive any messages while the updates are being installed that ask you whether you want to keep or replace any configuration files or particular programs, that is usually just because the system is getting some new configuration files that come down from the distribution, and you can just safely go ahead and say, I want to keep them. You may get prompted by the grub bootloader. It might ask you to confirm your boot device. That is normally SDA in a standard install, so just choose whatever that is and it should be perfectly all right, unless you chose something different when you originally installed Linux Mint. So if it was an automatic install and you didn't make any special choices there, just choose SDA. Okay, so all of our updates are now installed, and the next thing that we want to do before we do anything else is to reboot the machine. This is extremely important. Don't go messing around with things, because as the updates come in, it might have destabilized something in the system. So you want to make sure that you have a really stable system and that you're on your new updated kernel when you reboot. And I mentioned that earlier, but it does bear repeating. So once your first set of updates are all installed and you're ready to go, now the next step is to install any proprietary drivers that you might need to work on your computer. And this will usually be your video drivers, but you'll also see drivers for the microprocessor from AMD or Intel. And you may also have drivers that you need to install for a Wi-Fi card. So yes, we're still running in software rendering because we have not installed the drivers. Let's go ahead and close that and get that out of the way. We'll take care of that a little bit later on. So go ahead and open up the driver manager. You find that in your menu. Give it a password. And it's going to go out and look to see if there are any drivers available for this system. Now this is a virtual box, virtual machine, so there will be drivers available, and I'm going to install them from here to demonstrate how you do it. But if you are running Linux Mint in VirtualBox, I strongly recommend that you do it the way VirtualBox wants you to, and that is to use the VirtualBox Virtual CD, which has the guest editions program and the correct drivers for whatever version of VirtualBox you're running. But just for demonstration purposes, we'll go ahead and do it from here. So these are the drivers that are available to us. We do have the microcode driver. So let's go ahead and install that as well. So once you've selected your drivers, apply changes. For video cards, you may see more than one driver listed. Always choose the one that's recommended to start out with. The drivers are installed. That only took a couple of minutes, but if you are installing video drivers, it can take quite some time depending on how fast your computer is and how fast your internet connection is. Once again, while this is happening, it's a good idea just not to mess with the machine and let it do what it needs to do. And once it's done, make sure that you restart it. That is so all of the drivers will take effect. And when it comes back, it may say once again that it's in software rendering mode in this video, and that's simply because of the fact that sometimes with VirtualBox drivers, if it's, like I said, not the exact driver for the exact version of VirtualBox you're using, it'll do that on occasion. So we'll see what happens. I actually haven't tried it with Linux Mint 18.3 yet. And yes, it says it's in software rendering mode. We'll just pretend that didn't happen. And we'll go ahead and tell it we don't want the welcome screen to come up. A little bit later in the video, we'll remove the welcome screen permanently. So the next thing that we need to do is a little tweak that I find to be absolutely necessary in Linux Mint. This is something that the Linux Mint distribution does that I do not agree with, and it can sometimes cause problems when you're installing certain software from the Ubuntu repositories. So open up Synaptic Package Manager, and we don't want to see that. And then we want to go to Settings, and then Preferences, and then we want to consider recommended packages as dependencies. This is something that in most Ubuntu-based distributions and Ubuntu itself, that is automatically checked as on. In Linux Mint, they check it as off. And I don't know why. And sometimes when you install certain software, for instance, AbiWord is an application that's affected by this, some of the recommended applications that work with AbiWord do not come in, and then you have features that don't work, and you wonder why, and that's because there are certain packages that didn't get installed. The next thing that we want to do is configure a firewall. So go into Settings, right there, and scroll down to the bottom and find the firewall. And we want to put in a password, and you want to just turn this on. So right now it is turned off, and I have it set for home. And then if you are going to be using any applications that run a server on your machine, let's say SSH or CUPS, you will need to set rules so that they will actually work, or the firewall will block them. So to do that, just click on Rules and then the little plus sign. Let's go ahead and set one for CUPS. That's so you can share printers on the internet, or not on the internet, but on your local network. I probably wouldn't want to share a printer on the internet. And also, if you're going to be using SSH, and it does warn you that SSH sometimes has some security problems, but if you're using it on your local network and not putting it out on the web, then you shouldn't have any issues. So we've just added those rules. Those rules are added, and that is done. So we have our firewall in place, which means that we're safe. Now, if you are running on a network with a router that has a hardware firewall, you may elect not to do that. That's entirely up to you. I enable firewalls on everything just in case somebody finds their way into my network, which is highly unlikely, but it might happen. So the next thing that we need to set up is a program called Timeshift, and this is really important, and it is a new feature in Linux Mint 18.3. And this is a real, just a real lifesaver. So let me go ahead and put in Timeshift. I was typing in Firewall. What Timeshift does is it takes a snapshot of your Linux installation. And it works specifically with Ubuntu and Linux Mint. And the Linux Mint folks integrated it into Linux Mint 18.3. which means that it's also available on the live version. So if you ever have to recover from a live USB stick, you just plug it in, type in Timeshift, it'll find the snapshots and restore. So we're going to choose rsync. We're not running Btrfs. And then we'll go next. And it's going to go out and analyze the system, and it's going to find out how much free space is available and what drives are currently connected. And for a standard Linux Mint install, if you took the automatic options, it's going to find the same drive that the system is on. But if you have a separate home partition, or you happen to have other drives that are formatted with a Linux native file system, then it'll find those. In this case, we only have one choice, so we'll move on. It's a very small drive, of course, too, because this is a virtual machine. And this is to activate the Timeshift program. It will automatically take snapshots as your system runs. And the default configuration here, if you just activate monthly, weekly, and daily, is what is known as an M+1 backup. It will give you 2 monthlies, it will give you 3 weeklies, and 5 dailies, and that way you'll have snapshots of your operating system going way, way back. So let's move on to the next one. This is just something that it tells you about, a little bit about the system and how it works. We'll go ahead and finish. And there are some other options in here that I want to show you very quickly. This is the users option. You can opt to have Timeshift actually back up your personal files. This is things that are in the /home partition. I would not recommend doing that with this particular program, simply because it's going to take up a great deal of space. That's better done with an external drive. You can configure Timeshift to work with an external drive, and then you could include this and you could use that to take snapshots. But I happen to be the author of a program that does that, and it's called XBT, and I happen to think it's a better way of doing that. So I just wanted to show you that very quickly. And you can look at EZEELINUX.com to learn more about XBT and watch the video so you understand how that works. Also, if you happen to have configured Linux Mint with a RAID disk, a RAID array, instead of a standard hard drive, this program will not work. It does not see RAID arrays if you're using the RAID mapper on the system. And so therefore I would recommend a program called CYA, which I also had a hand in writing, and you can learn more about that at EZEELINUX.com. So the very first thing that you want to do once you have this set up is go ahead and create a snapshot. And this is going to be one that you're going to hang on to. It's not going to automatically be deleted as the snapshots grow. And this one is after the fresh install. Everything's set up. We haven't added any new software to the system. We haven't changed anything. We haven't configured the desktop. If you ever want to get back to your system just being as it was when you first installed it, then you might want to create a snapshot here. So let's go ahead and do that. Now I'm going to pause the video while this does this because it takes a little while to do the very first snapshot. The snapshot is created, and we need to give it a comment here so we know what it is when we look at Timeshift in the future. And we're just going to call this one Fresh Install. And so now that one will just stay there until we manually delete it. Over time, you're going to see more snapshots appear as the system does automatic backups of the operating system. So we have a completely configured Linux Mint system, but we're not done with the video because there are a couple of things that we can do to just gain a little bit more control over the system, a few tweaks that we can do to make things go a little bit faster and a little bit smoother. I'm going to show you those now. And these are completely optional. So if you are a total noob to Linux Mint, you don't have any idea what I'm talking about for the rest of this video, don't worry about it. But these are for slightly more advanced users and people that want to take more control of their machine. So the very first thing that we want to look at doing is turning on the write cache on your hard drives. Now, there's a little bit of fogginess in the documentation for this. I am given to understand that this is actually already on, but we want to take control of it. We want to kind of make sure that it's on, and that would depend on the kind of drive and the system you're on and all that stuff. And so we're going to go ahead and do that. Also, it'll let me show you some other settings that you can work with as well. Now, the disks application is very important, and at some point, even if you are not going to be fooling around with it, you need to open this up because it is going to tell you what condition your disk is in. For this virtual machine, it says smart data is not supported. That's just because it's a virtual hard drive. But if you were using a real hard drive, then you'd get a little readout here. And it would say disk is okay. It would let you know if there were any problems with your hard drive. Hard drives have a system on board called SMART. And what it does is it logs the number of times the drive is powered on and powered off, and whether it overheated, and whether it found any bad clusters somewhere, whether it's in danger of failing. So you want to open up disks every now and then to check it out anyway. It's a good thing to keep an eye on. And if disks tells you that there's something wrong, it would probably be a really good idea to go ahead and replace that drive. That's very important, especially for those of you who are reclaiming old computers. But what I want to show you here is drive settings. Now, we only have a couple here because of what the virtual drive supports, so we're not going to worry about standby. You can set that if you want to. That will spin down the hard drives after a period of time of inactivity, and you may want to do that if for some reason you want to configure your computer to be up and running all the time. In other words, it's never going to suspend, you're never going to turn it off, but that's entirely up to you. But mainly what I want to show you is write cache. So we want to go ahead and enable that. And what that does is it ensures that the system is going to hang on to stuff that it's writing to disk in memory and wait for the drive to become available to go ahead and take care of that a little bit later. This increases performance. And like I said, the documentation that I have read indicates that this is already enabled on your system, but we want to take control of it. If you, for some reason, want to turn it off in the future, you're going to have to turn it on here first. So go ahead and give it your password. And then it should have just gone ahead and taken that. So let's make sure that it did. Go to drive settings once again. Write cache is on. We're good to go. That is set and taken care of. So we can go ahead and close Timeshift too. We don't need that open. So the next thing that I want to show you how to do is to go through your startup applications and disable things that you're not going to need. You'll find this in settings. And this is something that is per user, which means that you will have to do this for every user account you set up on the system. So let's go ahead and look at those. And where are they? There they are, right there. And you see that you have several things that are set to load up when your computer turns on. So this is something new in Linux Mint 18.3. And this is because Linux Mint 18.3 now supports flat packages. So you probably want to leave that on in case you want to install something from the software Manager, that is Flatpak. Control alternate backspace, that is an emergency function that lets you log out of your system if your desktop starts acting crazy. So control alternate and backspace will just log you straight out. It's a nice feature to have enabled. Mint update, that's one that you definitely want to have turned on because that's going to run in the background and tell you when you have updates. However, for other users on the system that do not have administrator privileges, you probably want to turn that off. Mint welcome, we can go ahead and get rid of that because we don't need that popping up every time. And then we have support for NVIDIA Prime. And we don't need that because this is a virtual machine. If you're running NVIDIA, you might want to leave that on. If you have other graphics like AMD or Intel or whatever, then that definitely won't do you any good. You can also add applications here. If you want every time that you log into your system, for instance, that you have a terminal pop up, which is something that, if you are learning about the terminal, you might want to have done. We can choose an application. Just go down the list here and we look for terminal. We'll go ahead and add that. And then we can set a little bit of a delay, which is really good. This, by the way, is specific to Cinnamon, what I'm showing you, but every other desktop also has an application that does that. Like, for instance, Linux Mint with the Mate desktop or XFCE, you're going to be able to do exactly the same thing. Probably see a lot more in there as well. Because they give you a bit more control than Cinnamon does. But that gives you an idea of how to work with it. So once you do that, now when this system is rebooted, it is going to open up a terminal. So the next thing that I'm going to show you how to do is set a static IP address. And this is something that I haven't shown before, but I'm getting a lot of people that are asking about it. So when you first installed your system, you probably allowed your router to issue an address, and you put your password in for your network. If you were using Wi-Fi, if you're using Ethernet, then you probably don't have to put in a password. So that was all automatically configured. But if you are running SSH on your system, that's not what I wanted the network. Or if you are running some other type of server where on your local network you need to know that IP address. And then we're going to do this for the local network. This is not out on the public internet. Then just right-click on the network manager down here, and then click Network Connections. Choose the connection that you have set up. In this case, it's a wired connection because it's a virtual machine. We want to edit that. And now what we can do is we can set up different manual IP addresses here. We're going to take care of that. So mainly we're concerned with IP4 on most networks these days. So it is configured for automatic DHCP, which means that the router issues a local IP address for this machine. We don't want it to do that. We want to choose our own. So go ahead and set that to manual. And then we want to add. And then we are going to put the IP address that we want in here. How do you figure out some of this stuff, though? Like, you might need to know how your router is issuing those addresses. Well, let me show you real quick. You can open up a terminal. Alternate and control and the letter T opens up a terminal. Make that bigger so everybody can see it. And the command that I like to use to get this information is ifconfig, because I like the way it lays it out. So if I run ifconfig, it's telling us all about the network connections. Now, the first one here is the main connection, and this is your Ethernet connection, and you can get an idea of what this thing is doing. And we're mainly worried about IP4 addresses at this point. And you will see that the router has issued 192.168.0.9. And the broadcast is 192.168.0.55, and the net mask is 255.255.255.0, and we kind of need that information. So if we want to, for instance, have this computer always be, I'm just going to choose the next one available on my network, because I have a whole network of machines that are set up this way. So we'll choose as the address 192.168.0.16. We'll give this VM the address 16. Next thing we need to do is put in netmask, click over here. Now you can type in 255.255.255.0 if your system is working that way, but we're just going to use 24. That's the shorthand for that. Most home routers are using the 192.168 address table, so that should work just fine. So that can be put in as 255.255.255.0 or just 24. All right. That confused somebody I was working with the other day, because it'll default back to say it's 24 even if you put in that. So you'll go back and look at it later and you go, what has it got 24 there for? That's how that works. The gateway is the address to your router, and that is something that you are going to have to look at once again in ifconfig. So let's see if it tells us what our gateway is. You may need to look at the configuration for your router for that. I don't see it listed here for the gateway. So that is something, when you set up your router, you should be able to see what that is or set that, okay? So look at the documentation for your router. There's also a lot of great documentation online about this. But I happen to know that my gateway is 192. I'll make sure I get that correct. 192.168.0.1 is my gateway. And you see that now it looks normal. It didn't get ghosted out there, and that's because it actually is checking to see whether this stuff is out there. All right, DNS servers. This is how you turn host names into IP addresses. This is something that is usually handled by your ISP, so most people shouldn't have to worry about this. However, I have my router set up to cache the DNS so that it hangs around locally. It's not always going out to the internet every time somebody puts in a web address or a URL. It actually goes and it grabs it and then caches it locally. So if your router is set up to do that, once again, you have to know your configuration for your router. Then you can just set your router as the DNS. And I'll make sure I got that right. Yes, 192.168.0.1. So that is DNS for this network. And then we want to require IP4 addressing. And as far as IP6 settings are concerned, we can just go ahead and tell it to ignore that entirely. So we're not even bothering with IP6 as far as the configuration is concerned. Now, the next time that you reconnect, you're going to get that address. Right now, you've got whatever you're connected to at the moment, whatever the router gave out. So, yeah, and I have no problem showing you those addresses because many other networks are set up that way. That is for the internal network. That's not the external addresses for the network. So finally, the last thing that I want to show you is a little tweak that you can do in the terminal. And this is the only one like this where you use a terminal to actually change something. And that is to reclaim some space on your drive. So when the ext4 file system, which is the default file system for Linux Mint, installs itself, what it does is it sets aside 5% of the disk space for use by the system. That's in case you accidentally fill up the entire drive. If the system has no space to work with, then it can't even recover. It'll just crash. It may not even boot the next time if that drive gets completely full. So the file system itself sets aside 5%. Now, most of the time, that it doesn't add up to a whole lot of space, especially if you're working with a small drive. Like anything under 50 gigabytes, you wouldn't notice the difference. However, as drives get bigger, that 5% gets larger. So let's say that on your system, you've got a terabyte drive for your Linux Mint system. That adds up to a lot of space. You might want to reclaim that. And the way to do that is to use a command called tune2fs. And the first thing that we need to do is determine where our file system that we want to adjust is mounted, so we know what we're working with. So that command is lsblock, lsblk, and that will just list the drives. So in our case, the one that we want to work on is the root, which is right here, and that is on SDA1. If you did a automatic install, that's where it's going to show up, and that's the one that we want to work with. So the command that you put in for this to adjust this is this: sudo tune to fs -m, and then we're going to reset it to 1%. So the number here is going to be the percent that you set. You probably don't want to set it to 0. You can if you want to. That just means there's no reserve space at all. We're just trying to reclaim some space. We don't want to take it away. You never know. A program might go absolutely insane and start gobbling up disk space. And then if you end up with no disk space available, you might not be able to reboot the system or anything. I mean, there's nothing you can do. Once it runs out, it's gone. So the kernel will just go, I can't work, and that's it. So we'll just leave it at 1, which is okay. And then we need to tell it exactly where to go. So we will do dev, which is the device directory, and that's where all of the devices on your computer show up. And then SDA 1. And so what this is going to do is it's going to reset that. Put your password in and turn it loose. And it just takes a couple of seconds. So now it has been reset to just 1%. And we should actually reclaim a little bit of space on the disk. Now, this is such a small drive because this is a virtual machine that you're not going to see that. It's just maybe a few megabytes. But if you're dealing with a large drive, this can add up to many, many, many gigabytes. And it just kind of bugs me sometimes that those drives are not showing their full potential. And you can go ahead and reset that. And that's totally, completely optional. So that's it, gang. You should be good to go now. You can restart your computer, and you can start using Linux Mint, and you can install the software that you want to install and do whatever you want with it. It is completely configured. Those of you who have been watching my videos for quite some time may be wondering, well, where is the tweak about resetting swappiness? Why aren't you showing us that? It's because I don't do it anymore. I have found that reducing the swappiness, resetting it to like 10, and I've discussed that in past videos. Yes, it will make your machine go faster, but if you actually did have something that started gobbling up memory like that and it was set to 10, then it becomes more unstable. The default is 60, and I leave it at 60 these days, and for most things that most people do with a computer, it's perfectly all right to do that. Let the swap be managed by the kernel that way. If you're gaming or you're running servers, you might want to adjust that. And if that's the case, all you got to do to find out more is look up swappiness on the internet, and many different opinions about that will pop up and all kinds of stuff. So that's the one thing I am not including in this video. So thank you very much for watching. I do appreciate it. This has been EZEELINUX Show version 18.1. And you can find out more about EZEELINUX by checking us out on the web at easylinux.com. Also, check out Freedom Penguin, which is a very cool website with lots of content about Linux to find out more about Linux. And follow and like us on Facebook, if you would, please. That's an ever-growing community there. The links for all of that are in the description to the video, and below that you are going to see the text that you have on the screen. So you can kind of maybe print that out, follow along, if you are going to be configuring Linux Mint for the first time. Now, for the first part here, I don't know whether I said this, and I just want to make it clear, the order does matter. But for the optional configurational, I've got optimal. It should be optional. I'll change that when I put it in the description for the video. You can just do that in any order at any time that you want to. If you have already set up Linux Mint, and for instance you didn't know that you could set Synaptic Package Manager to consider recommended packages as dependencies, then that's fine. You can set that at any time. That's one that you can do in any order. But those the ones as far as the configuration there on the mandatory configuration steps, yeah, you really need to do that in the order that you see. So thank you for watching. We will do it again soon.